This is Lesson 3 for beginning students of the Dance of the Eye and the Hand. Today we'll begin to look at landscape painting. We'll paint rocks and trees, and do leaves as dots and circles, and end with painting distant pines.
Welcome back. So today we're going to switch from focused on calligraphy to focusing on landscape. And we'll start with talking about the basics of landscape, and then we'll move on to our model, painting some rocks and painting some trees. So let's get started.
So let's begin to consider Chinese landscape painting. Where do you think the painter began? At its very core, Chinese landscape all begins with trees and rocks. Take a look at the painting here. Can you find this basic rock form in the painting at left? Can you find this basic tree in the painting at left? To paint a basic rock, we start with the outline. Then we add the shading lines. To paint a basic tree, we start with the structure, starting with the first branching of the trunk, painting that V and then down, build the structure as it grows, and then we add the leaves.
So to get started, let's review grinding some ink. I'm taking just a little bit of water, not even a spoonful, my ink stick, and just making circles in my ink stone. And again, grinding ink is a good transitional exercise, helps slow you down, get you here, focus on what am I going to be painting today, and putting aside other thoughts as best you can. Keep grinding, not too strongly, but with enough pressure to grind the ink stick in the water into ink. Now I'm beginning to see some dry areas on the stone, and that tells me that I'm moving from water to ink, and I will grind a little longer just to be sure I have enough. And then put my ink stick aside, move my dish over. Since I'm starting this session fresh, I have a dry brush, so I'm going to get it wet in my water dish and then wick off some of that moisture. Use my mixing dish to further get my hairs parallel, and then pick up a little bit of ink in the dish, come back to my dish, and just long pulls horizontal the length of the hairs, turning, then pulling, turning, then pulling. I don't want to twist these hairs to get a point, because then when I press down, I'm going to splay the point and lose my point. Tap it a bit to see what I have, and then I'm ready to go. So we're transitioning from calligraphy to landscape, while I'll still keep a similar fingering, thumb towards me, next two fingers away, last two fingers towards me. In doing landscape, I'm more relaxed in being able to use more of the side of the brush and not keep that perpendicular relationship to the paper. We're going to be doing rock. In painting anything within Chinese brush painting, you really want to focus on what are you painting. If I'm painting the character for love, what is the character for love? What does love mean? And try to pull that essence up down your arm through the brush and onto the paper. Same is true with landscape. If I'm painting a rock, I want to think about what is the essence of rock. It is a hard surface. It's fairly permanent. It doesn't waver. So I want a line that has that sense about it. In painting landscape, as in painting characters, there is generally an order in which you paint them. With rock, we start with the outline, and then we do the shading lines inside. So let's do one right now. Starting with left side, and I'm going to start at the top and go, I'm pressing as I come down, and want a line that has some body to it, some substance. Again, pressing, using more of the side of the brush There's my outline. Then I do shading lines, and shading lines just sort of echo my outline. I start up high, I press, lock it into the base so that I get a low center of gravity. Other side, again, starting up high, and again, just kind of an echo of that outline to form and define my space. So that's one rock. Let's try another one. Again, starting on the top side, going down one side, and then the other. Then my shading lines, again, just echoing that outline, or like a reverberation. Pressing as I go down, slowing down, and I'm using more the side of the brush so I can get a broken line, or what we would call flying white, and that is just fine. That adds some texture. So let's move on to trees. So now we're going to try a couple of trees. And again, trees, like rocks, like the characters, have what I would call a stroke order. There's a precise succession of strokes that you do to build a tree. I'm going to pick up a little more ink using black ink, not a whole lot. In painting a tree, I look at the model and I want to find the first branching, the first V that comes out of the trunk. I draw that first V and then I pull the length of my trunk down. First one side and then the other. And like with rocks, I want to be thinking of the essence of treeness. Rock line was a solid line, sort of concrete. Tree is a strong line, but it has some movement in it. So just thick or thin doesn't make strong or weak. It's the energy you put into it. So whether it's a thin line or a thicker line, I want strong, but I want some movement in it. So I've done my V, I've pulled down both sides of my trunk. I can add a couple of root lines here, maybe a couple of knot holes. Then I look at my model and I look for the next branching. Make that V, pull it down, connect it to my trunk. Look for another branching. And it's important to do this in this progression, because if you start out here too far making all kinds of V's, you may not be able to knit them together. Let's do another smaller tree over here. Again, looking for that beginning V, and then bring down my trunk. This trunk has a little bit of a sway to it. And again, a couple of lines for roots, a couple of knot holes. Now, my V's, depending upon their direction and their width, the opening of that angle, can change the direction of my tree. I can go off to one side, I can go off almost horizontally, depending upon how I aim and how wide of an angle I have. So now I'm going to put some water in my dish and mix up with the ink that was in my brush. If you don't have an inky brush, put a little ink into it and mix it into the water, and I want to get a nice gray. I can go a little bit lighter than that. More water I put in, the lighter I get. Once I have a gray I like, I want to dry my brush off just a bit so it isn't sopping wet with wash, and just load the tip, mix that in. Now we're going to do some leaves. We're going to start with a larger tree with dots as leaves. And to do leaves, I want to go back to a calligraphy position, perpendicular to the page, my fingering, thumb towards me, next two fingers away, last two fingers towards me. And all I'm going to do is press the brush to the paper. I'm not drawing a circle. I'm not moving the brush. I'm just letting the brush do the work. And I want to let it bleed. I want to overpaint this so that these overlap. If I paint them as I see in the model, when they dry, they'll be too far apart because a percentage of all of this is water. The beauty of Schwen paper is that it records every impression. Every time you touch it, that is recorded on the paper, and that gives the richness and the depth and the beauty to this kind of painting. So doing dots can be mesmerizing, if not hypnotic. While that is pleasant, we don't want to get lost in that process. Our intent here is to stay in the present and to put just a little bit of intention into every single stroke. If my brush slows down, I go back and get some more wash. I want to avoid anything that looks like a pattern, like a row or a line, a column. I can vary the size a little bit depending upon the effect I'm going for. The other thing I want to remember as I'm doing this is I've drawn just a couple of branches, and what I'm doing now with the dots is showing the structure that I cannot see. So I'm not just randomly putting up blobs of dots, but I want to be showing what is the underlying structure of this tree. And the better attuned I am to that, the stronger the tree I will paint. Let's move on to this side. And again, just press. Let the brush do the work. You can just enjoy the ride. Not too fast. And start slowing down, get a little bit more so that you have some bleed going on. Dots are wet strokes, and what we are learning here is how to work with and control wet ink. And I just continue onward. Now, as you get more skilled at doing this, you can change the tone of gray in the dots so that some groups are darker gray, some might be a lighter gray. And again, we're showing that structure that's unseen. So now once we have it populated, we can go look around again and see, are those pleasing shapes? Do I need to add anything to make it even more appealing in terms of composition and outline? So, dots as leaves. Now I'm going to do circle leaves, and first thing I'm going to do is take my tissue and just dry off my brush, doing it long horizontal pulls, not twisting it, getting a dry brush, but also a brush with a good point. And I'm going to make a circle leaf, which is simply that. I just take the point of the brush, again in calligraphy stance, upright perpendicular to the page, and do a circle and a dot, another circle and a dot, And these are circles and not horseshoes, so that if I were to close the dot, the circle would disappear. If you put the circle in the center, you get a tree of eyeballs. And unless it's Halloween, that can be just a bit gruesome, or if you're doing a painting for Tim Burton, that might be appropriate. But otherwise, we want to be sure we're putting the circle at the base. That's its connection to the tree. Leaves like this would be often seen in autumn paintings. You could then add color to it after you're done with all of your line work. Although with the use of many grays, you can create the sense of color without actually using anything other than the ink. And like dots, this can be hypnotic, and we want to do our best to try and stay in the present and stay with the intention of putting just a little bit of energy into every single circle. Other common error, besides just making them like horseshoes or putting the dots in the middle of the leaf, is to do them too small. The smaller you do them, the more you're going to have to do, so do them big. And again, this is giving you practice in how to control gray ink in your brush. And as the ink gets drier in the brush, you can slow down, or you can just add a little bit more. I'm barely touching the tip to the wash. You can literally do hundreds of leaves with very little ink. It's a very efficient system. So, circle leaves, leaves as dots. We'll do one more item before we finish today. I'm going to take my brush and just pick up a little bit of ink, just a little bit, and I'm going to make a couple of distant pine trees. And we start with black ink and just make 1, 2 vertical lines. Then go back to our wash, pick up some wash, make sure it's gray. And I'm going to use my brush almost horizontal to the paper and just pull in short strokes. I can vary the width, I can vary the length, but what I'm painting is a distant pine tree. Again, I want to press and have these overlap so that when they dry, I can see each and every stroke. Let's do another distant pine. We start again with just pair of verticals in black, switch to a gray, and just pulling the brush across the page, pressing as I go so I get a little bit of a bleed. And distant pine trees. And distant pines are always small. You would never take this shape and make it big. That would you would use a totally different structure for a large pine. But for distant pines, pair of verticals, horizontals drawn across. So that's our lesson for this week, your first lesson in landscape. We can practice some rocks, practice some trunks, and circle leaves, and dots as leaves, and distant pine. So let's give it a try.
Before you go, one last note. The handouts for the Dance of the Eye and the Hand for beginning students and continuing students, all lessons, are posted as downloadable PDFs at www.laughingwatersstudio.com. Have a good day. You have been watching Distance Learning from Laughing Waters Studio.